friends? Well, I was robbed over the weekend. Now, before you become alarmed, I wasn't robbed by a person, but by a thing, or actually things. I was robbed by the vegetable aisle at the grocery store. I was robbed by Pump 9 at Circle K. I was robbed by the restaurant that we went to with the price increases. You see, inflation is robbing most Americans. Longtime economist Milton Friedman said that inflation is taxation without legislation. Let's make no mistake about it. The current administration has facilitated inflation. And that's not a political comment, that's just a reality that started at the end of the Trump presidency with COVID bailout and persisted into the beginning of this new administration by printing and supplying money. Much like turning on a water faucet in a bathtub, it fills or lifts things up. Well, the good news with bath time, which I do every night with the kids, is you can unplug the drain or reduce the money supply. That's the M2, the money supply can be increased or decreased by the Federal Reserve. However, the increase in money supply has been one of the largest factors to the increase in costs. So if you've got $1 today that bought you $1's worth of goods a year ago, that dollar only buys you about 90 to 92 cents worth of goods today. So what investors ought to be thinking about is how to inflation-proof, or at least inflation mitigate their investment portfolio. Now there's three things that come to mind in particular around inflation proofing or inflation reducing investors' portfolios. Number one, it might seem obvious, but is own things, get exposure to areas of the market that bear the burden of inflation with you. Let me give you an example. In our last video, we talked about how companies like UPS, McDonald's, Costco, and others are committed to raising their dividends on an annual basis. So instead of making you, the investor, bear the weight of this 8 to 10% inflation over the last year, Costco, by raising their dividend, is helping bear that burden with you. So getting exposure to companies or investments that help bear the burden of inflation. Another example is floating rate real estate. So real estate investors, if you're locked into a 20-year lease or a 10-year lease at a fixed percentage rent, you as the owner have to bear the burden of rising costs because that rent is staying the same. Floating rate or adjustable rate investments float up with interest rates and therefore mitigate or at least reduce the impacts of inflation. And there are others, certainly, but those are just two examples. So number one way to inflation-proof or begin to inflation-proof your portfolio is to own investments that participate or share the burden of inflation with you. Number two, and this is just the other side of that same coin, decrease exposure to investments that do poorly in inflationary environments. Think about CDs, or think about fixed annuities, or any fixed rate investment for a term means you as the investor have to eat all of that inflation. So the first thing you do to begin to set your portfolio up for inflation is to own investments that do well or that help bear that burden with you of rising inflation. The second way that you do that is to decrease exposure in your portfolio to those sectors or investments that don't do well. The first of those would be those fixed or static interest rate investments, but also companies or sectors that just don't do well. So think about companies that cannot pass along inflation to consumers. Your electricity company, they can't raise your electric bill simply because inflation is up, but Coca-Cola can. They could just raise the price of a can of Coke. And so getting less exposure to those sectors. Here's the third thing that investors need to be doing to manage the impacts of inflation in their portfolio is decrease cash positions. Cash is a sitting duck or a fish in a barrel or whatever other example you might want to use. It is going to be negatively impacted, and we've got no indication that inflation has peaked yet, which means we could be headed for continual multi-year rising inflation. Your cash will get crushed. So looking for alternative spaces for cash is the third and probably one of the most important things that investors can do to help begin to manage the impacts of inflation. Now, you know this, as investors, we all have different risk tolerances, and there's no way to be certain that your portfolio is completely immune from inflation impacts. And that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is taking some obvious tactical movements to prepare and to begin to align your portfolio with a rising interest rate environment to the likes that we haven't seen in 40 years. So the question you ought to be asking is your portfolio ready for inflation, or is it ready to get eaten by inflation? These are the questions you need answered, and these are the conversations you need to be having. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.